Think about this for a second. Every single paycheck you earn, the government takes a cut before you even see it. It feels like the most natural thing in the world, right? Like it's always been this way. But here's the thing. For the first 124 years of America's existence, there was no federal income tax. None. No IRS knocking on your door. No April 15th deadline. No withholding from your wages. And yet, somehow, the United States managed to fight wars, build roads, expand across an entire continent, pay its soldiers, fund a navy, and grow from 13 ragged colonies into one of the most powerful nations on earth. So the obvious question becomes, if the government wasn't reaching into your pocket, where was the money coming from? The answer to that question takes us into a world most Americans were never taught about. A world of customs houses and merchant ships, of whiskey revolts and backroom railroad deals, of frontier land being sold off like merchandise, and of a tax system so different from what we have today that it would be almost unrecognizable to a modern taxpayer. And what you'll find isn't just a story about dollars and cents, it's a story about power, about who really paid for America, who benefited, and how a single constitutional amendment in 1913 permanently rewired the relationship between the citizen and the state. So let's start at the very beginning, because understanding how America funded itself before the income tax means understanding what kind of country the founders were actually trying to build. When the American colonies finally won their independence from Britain, they were broke. And I don't mean that casually. The new nation was drowning in debt. The Revolutionary War had cost a staggering amount of money, and the Continental Congress had financed much of it through I owe us bonds and printed currency that was rapidly losing its value. In fact, the phrase, not worth a continental, became a popular insult, referring to the near-worthless paper money that Congress had flooded into the economy during the war. The states had individually racked up their own debts as well, and nobody had a clear plan for how to pay any of it back. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government had almost no power to raise revenue at all. It could ask the states to contribute money, but it couldn't compel them. And surprise, surprise, the states often refused to pay. The central government was essentially begging for funds, and the whole system was falling apart. This was actually one of the major reasons the Constitutional Convention was called in 1787. The men who gathered in Philadelphia that summer weren't just there to create a more perfect union in some abstract philosophical sense. They were there because the country was going bankrupt, and somebody needed the authority to actually collect revenue and pay the bills. So when the Constitution was ratified, it gave Congress the power to levy taxes. But here's what's crucial. The founders were extremely cautious about what kind of taxes the federal government could impose. They had just fought a revolution partly over the principle of taxation without representation, and they were deeply suspicious of giving any central authority too much power over people's earnings. The Constitution specifically stated that direct taxes, meaning taxes levied directly on individuals or their property, had to be apportioned among the states according to population. This was a massive restriction. It meant that if the federal government wanted to impose a direct tax, it had to divide the total amount among the states based on how many people lived in each one. The practical effect of this was to make direct taxation incredibly cumbersome and politically difficult. So what did that leave? It left indirect taxes, and the most important of those was the tariff. Now, if you want to understand how America really worked for its first century, you need to understand tariffs, because they were the engine that powered the entire federal government. A tariff is simply a tax on imported goods. When a ship full of British textiles or French wine or Spanish iron arrived at an American port, the government charged a fee on those goods before they could be sold in the country. The money went straight to the federal treasury. The very first significant piece of legislation passed by the first Congress under the new Constitution was the Tariff Act of 1789, signed into law on the 4th of July. And that date was no accident. The founders understood the symbolic weight of linking America's financial independence to the anniversary of its political independence. This first tariff imposed an average rate of about 10% on imported goods, and it was designed primarily to raise revenue. In its first decade, approximately 80% of the federal government's income came from tariffs. Let that sink in. 4 out of every $5 the government spent came from taxes on imports. The man behind the system was Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton was arguably the most financially sophisticated mind among the founders, and he had a vision for America that went far beyond simply collecting enough money to keep the lights on. Hamilton wanted to use tariffs not just to raise revenue, but to shape the American economy itself. He believed the United States needed to develop its own manufacturing base rather than remaining dependent on European imports. Higher tariffs on manufactured goods would make foreign products more expensive, giving American factories a competitive advantage. It was protectionism, and it was deliberate. But Hamilton also understood that tariffs had a political advantage that made them uniquely suited to a young democracy. They were hidden. When a merchant paid a tariff at the port, they simply raised the price of their goods to cover the cost. The consumer who bought those goods never saw the tax. There was no line on a receipt, no annual filing, no government agent showing up at your farm. You paid for the government every time you bought imported cloth or drank imported tea, but you never felt the sting directly. This made tariffs remarkably easy to collect and politically tolerable. The customs houses at America's ports became, in effect, the government's cash registers. Now, Hamilton faced a practical challenge that most people overlook. It's one thing to pass a tariff law. It's another thing entirely to actually collect the money. America in 1789 was a sprawling country with thousands of miles of coastline. Ships could dock at countless harbors, inlets, and wharves. Smuggling was rampant, and the federal government had essentially no enforcement apparatus whatsoever. Hamilton built one from scratch. By 1790, customs duties constituted roughly 95% of total federal receipts, and the operation he designed to collect them was, for its time, a masterpiece of bureaucratic efficiency. Collectors, naval officers, and surveyors were stationed at every major port. They inspected ship manifests, appraised goods, and levied duties before any merchandise could be cleared for sale. The system divided the entire coastline into revenue districts, and the money flowed upward to the Treasury Department. But Hamilton knew that relying entirely on one revenue source was dangerous. Trade was unpredictable. Wars could disrupt shipping lanes. Economic downturns could reduce the volume of imports. So he pushed for a supplementary source of income, and this is where things got violent. In 1791, Hamilton persuaded Congress to pass the first ever federal excise tax on a domestic product, and that product was distilled spirits, whiskey. Now, on paper, this seemed reasonable enough. The government needed more revenue, and whiskey was widely consumed. But on the American frontier, particularly in western Pennsylvania, this tax landed like a punch to the gut. You have to understand, for farmers living on the frontier in the 1790s, whiskey wasn't a luxury, it was an economic necessity. These were small-scale farmers who grew grain, primarily corn and rye, but getting that grain to market over the Appalachian Mountains was incredibly difficult and expensive. However, if you distilled that grain into whiskey, you suddenly had a product that was far more valuable per pound, much easier to transport, and in some areas actually served as a form of currency. Whiskey was money on the frontier, and now the federal government, sitting hundreds of miles away in Philadelphia, was demanding cash payment on every gallon produced. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Farmers organized protests. They formed democratic societies. Tax collectors were threatened, intimidated, and in some cases, physically attacked. In 1793, a mob broke into the home of a Pennsylvania tax officer named Benjamin Wells and assaulted his wife and children. The following year, in July of 1794, roughly 500 armed men surrounded and set fire to the home of John Neville, the regional tax collection supervisor. The Whiskey Rebellion, as it came to be known, was the first serious test of the new federal government's authority. President George Washington faced a genuine crisis. This wasn't just about whiskey or tax revenue. It was about whether the federal government had the power to enforce its own laws. Washington first tried diplomacy, issuing proclamations urging the rebels to disperse. When that failed, he made a decision that still echoes through American history. He personally led a force of nearly 13,000 militiamen, drawn from Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, on a month-long march across the Allegheny Mountains to suppress the rebellion. It was the only time in American history that a sitting president personally commanded troops in the field. By the time the militia arrived, the rebellion had largely collapsed. The leaders had fled, and about 150 men were arrested, though only 20 were held for trial and just 2 were ultimately convicted. Both were later pardoned. But the message was clear. The federal government would enforce its tax laws, by force if necessary. The Whiskey Rebellion lasted only a few months, but its echoes reverberated for years. It revealed something fundamental about the politics of taxation in a republic. You can design a tax that makes perfect economic sense on paper, but if the people who have to pay it believe it's unjust, you've got a problem that no amount of military force can permanently solve. The irony of the Whiskey Rebellion is that it actually undermined public support for the excise tax. The political fallout helped fuel the rise of Thomas Jefferson's Republican Party, which opposed Hamilton's financial system. When Jefferson became president in 1801, one of his first acts was to abolish all internal taxes, including the whiskey excise. Jefferson believed the federal government could and should survive on tariff revenue alone. And for a while he was right. Under Jefferson and his successors, the federal government operated on a remarkably lean budget. Federal spending in the early 1800s averaged less than 2% of the nation's total economic output. Compare that to today, where federal spending hovers around 20 to 25% of GDP. The government of the early republic was almost unimaginably small by modern standards. It didn't run social programs. It didn't provide welfare, health care, or old age pensions. It didn't subsidize agriculture. It maintained a modest military, paid for a small diplomatic corps, ran the postal service, and handled the basic business of governance. That was essentially it. And because the government was so small, tariff revenue was usually more than enough to cover its costs. In fact, there were long stretches where the government ran surpluses. Between 1820 and 1862, federal revenue fluctuated between roughly 1% and 3% of GDP, and customs duties accounted for between 50 and 90% of total federal income, depending on the year. But tariffs weren't the only game in town. There was another significant revenue source that most people have completely forgotten about, and it was hiding in plain sight, literally under their feet. I'm talking about public land sales. When the United States was founded, the federal government owned an almost incomprehensible amount of land. The territory west of the original 13 colonies, acquired through the Revolution and subsequent treaties, belonged to the federal government. And as the nation expanded through the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, the acquisition of Florida, the Mexican-American War, and the Oregon Treaty, the public domain grew to encompass hundreds of millions of acres. From very early on, the sale of this land was seen as a major revenue opportunity. The Land Ordinance of 1785, passed even before the Constitution, established a system for surveying and selling public land. The territory was divided into 6-mile squares called townships, which were further divided into 36 sections of 640 acres each. Initially, the government sold land in large parcels at relatively high prices, which suited Alexander Hamilton just fine. He saw land sales as a way to fill the treasury. But over time, the political pressure shifted. Westerners and agrarian reformers pushed for cheaper land and smaller lots, arguing that the point of the public domain wasn't to generate revenue for the treasury, but to create a nation of independent farmers. By 1820, the minimum purchase was reduced to 80 acres at a fixed price of $1.25 per acre. Land sales became a significant revenue stream, sometimes generating almost as much money as customs duties. In some peak years, during the 1830s, when land speculation was rampant, revenue from public land sales nearly equaled tariff revenue. This system created entire booms and busts. In the 1830s, under President Andrew Jackson, land speculation reached fever pitch. Speculators borrowed money from state banks, bought up huge tracts of public land, and then resold them at enormous markups to settlers pouring in from the east. The government's land office was overwhelmed. Revenue from land sales surged. In 1836 alone, land sales generated nearly $25 million, a staggering sum for the era. But it was a bubble, and like all bubbles, it burst. Jackson's own Specie Circular of 1836, which required that public land be purchased with gold or silver rather than paper currency, helped trigger the Panic of 1837, one of the worst financial crises in American history. Land revenues collapsed virtually overnight. Then came the Homestead Act of 1862, signed by Abraham Lincoln, which fundamentally changed the equation. Instead of selling public land, the government began giving it away. Any citizen or aspiring citizen could claim 160 acres of public land for free, provided they lived on it, improved it, and paid a small filing fee. Between 1862 and 1934, the federal government granted 1.6 million homesteads, distributing 270 million acres, a full 10% of all land in the United States, for private ownership. It was the largest transfer of public wealth to private citizens in American history, but it also meant the end of public land sales as a major revenue source. The government was, in a very real sense, in the real estate business, and it was a business that perfectly aligned with the national project of westward expansion. Every acre sold was an acre settled, and every settler was a future taxpayer, a future customer, a future soldier. The public domain was simultaneously a source of revenue, a tool for nation building, and a political prize that different factions fought over for decades. But here's the thing about tariffs and land sales. They weren't politically neutral. They created winners and losers, and the fights over who paid and who benefited were some of the most vicious in American political history. Nowhere was this more evident than in the battle over protective tariffs, which nearly tore the country apart decades before the Civil War. The northern states, which were developing a manufacturing economy, wanted high tariffs to protect their factories from cheaper British imports. The southern states, which grew cotton for export and imported most of their manufactured goods, despised high tariffs because they raised the prices of everything southerners bought while doing nothing to help their agricultural economy. In fact, high tariffs were doubly harmful to the South because they risked provoking retaliatory tariffs from Britain, which was the South's biggest customer for cotton. This tension exploded in 1828 when Congress passed what became known as the Tariff of Abominations. The rates on some imported goods climbed as high as 50%, and the South was furious. Vice President John C. Calhoun of South Carolina secretly authored a document called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, in which he laid out the doctrine of nullification, the idea that a state had the right to declare a federal law unconstitutional and refuse to enforce it within its borders. When a slightly modified tariff was passed in 1832, South Carolina didn't just protest, it acted. The state legislature passed an ordinance of nullification, declaring both the 1828 and 1832 tariffs null and void within South Carolina's borders. They even threatened to secede from the Union if the federal government tried to enforce the tariffs by force. Now, this wasn't just a legal dispute. This was a constitutional crisis that threatened to dissolve the Union 3 decades before the Civil War. And at its heart was a question about taxation, not about how much to tax or what to tax, but about who had the ultimate authority to decide. Was the federal government sovereign, or were the states? The answer to that question, and the violence it would eventually take to settle it, was already being rehearsed in 1832 over tariff schedules. President Andrew Jackson, himself a Southerner and a slaveholder, was not about to let a state defy the federal government. He issued a thundering proclamation denouncing nullification as treason and made it clear he was prepared to use military force to collect the tariffs. Jackson reportedly told a South Carolina congressman that if a single drop of blood was shed in defiance of the federal government, he would hang the first man he could lay hands on. The crisis was eventually defused through a compromise tariff in 1833 that gradually reduced rates, but the fundamental conflict between North and South over tariffs and federal power continued to fester. It was a rehearsal for the Civil War, and it was the Civil War that brought about the first American income tax. When Confederate soldiers fired on Fort Sumter in April of 1861, President Abraham Lincoln found himself facing an existential crisis, and not just a military one. He needed money, and he needed it fast. The tariffs and excise taxes that had sustained the relatively lean federal budget were nowhere near sufficient to fund a full-scale war. The Union Army was growing by the day, soldiers needed to be equipped and fed, and the costs were astronomical. On the 4th of July, 1861, Lincoln convened a special session of Congress. The message was blunt. The Union needed new revenue sources, and it needed them immediately. Under the leadership of Senator William Pitt Fessenden of Maine, the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, Congress drafted the Revenue Act of 1861. Lincoln signed it into law on August 5th. The bill raised existing tariffs, imposed a new tax on real estate, and most importantly, it levied something that had never existed before in America, a federal income tax. The tax was a flat 3% on all annual incomes above $800. That threshold, roughly equivalent to $18,000 today, meant that only the wealthiest Americans would pay it. Lincoln also created the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the ancestor of today's IRS, along with a network of tax assessors and collectors to enforce the law. For the first time in American history, the federal government was reaching directly into the earnings of individual citizens. A year later, the Revenue Act of 1862 went even further. It replaced the flat rate with a graduated scale, 3% on incomes between $600 and $10,000, and 5% on incomes above $10,000. This was the first progressive income tax in American history, the idea that wealthier people should pay a higher rate. Congress also imposed excise taxes on virtually everything: tobacco, alcohol, playing cards, billiard tables, yachts, carriages, and even slaughtered cattle. The federal government was taxing the country like never before, and the money was desperately needed. But here's what's critical to understand. Everyone, from Lincoln to Congress to the public, understood the wartime income tax as a temporary emergency measure. It was never intended to be permanent. And indeed, after the war ended, the income tax was gradually reduced and finally repealed entirely in 1872. The country went back to its old system of tariffs and excise taxes, and for the next 2 decades, that's how the federal government funded itself. But the world was changing, and the old system was starting to crack. The period after the Civil War, the Gilded Age, saw an explosion of industrial wealth unlike anything in human history. The railroads, the steel mills, the oil refineries, the banks, men like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and J.P. Morgan amassed fortunes that dwarfed anything that had come before. Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled 90% of American refining. Carnegie's steel empire was producing more steel than all of Great Britain. And while these titans of industry were accumulating staggering wealth, ordinary workers were toiling in dangerous factories for poverty wages, living in cramped tenements, and watching the gap between rich and poor widen into a chasm. The tariff system, which had been the backbone of federal revenue for a century, was increasingly seen as part of the problem. High protective tariffs benefited manufacturers by shielding them from foreign competition, but they also raised the prices of everyday goods for consumers. A working family in 1890 was paying more for clothing, tools, sugar, and 100 other necessities because of tariff-inflated prices. In effect, the tariff was a regressive tax. It hit the poor harder than the rich because the poor spent a larger share of their income on basic goods. Meanwhile, the industrial barons who were getting fabulously wealthy paid nothing directly to the federal government for the privilege. There was no tax on their income, no tax on their profits, no tax on the enormous fortunes they were accumulating. The entire cost of the federal government was being borne, indirectly but unmistakably, by consumers through higher prices on imported goods. The system was, to many Americans, fundamentally unfair. The political dynamics around the tariff were also becoming increasingly toxic. By the 1880s and 1890s, the tariff had become the single most important issue in American politics. Elections were won and lost over tariff rates. The Republican Party, closely allied with northern industrial interests, championed high protective tariffs. The Democratic Party, drawing strength from the agricultural South and West, pushed for lower tariffs. The debate consumed Congress session after session, and the tariff schedules themselves became absurdly complex, with different rates for thousands of individual products, each one the result of intense lobbying by specific industries. What made the situation even more absurd was that the government was actually collecting too much revenue. During the 1880s, the federal government ran consistent surpluses. There was literally more money coming in from tariffs than the government could spend. But instead of lowering tariffs to reduce the surplus, Congress spent the excess on pork barrel projects and patronage, or simply left it sitting in the Treasury, sucking money out of the economy. The surplus itself became a political crisis, but neither party could agree on how to fix it because any change to the tariff meant upsetting a powerful constituency. This growing sense of injustice fueled the progressive movement, which began pushing for a federal income tax as a matter of basic fairness. The idea was simple. Instead of funding the government through tariffs that raised prices for everyone, why not fund it through a tax on income that would fall most heavily on those who could most afford to pay? In 1894, Congress attempted to do exactly that. As part of the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act, lawmakers included a provision for a modest income tax, 2% on all incomes above $4,000, roughly equivalent to $90,000 today. It was the first peacetime income tax in American history, and it was immediately controversial. A man named Charles Pollock, a shareholder in the Farmers Loan and Trust Company, filed a lawsuit to stop the company from paying the tax. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in 1895, the court issued a bombshell ruling. In Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, the justices ruled 5-4 that the income tax was a direct tax, and because it hadn't been apportioned among the states according to population, as the Constitution required for direct taxes, it was unconstitutional. The decision was devastating for income tax advocates. Justice John Marshall Harlan, writing a blistering dissent, warned that the ruling would make it nearly impossible to tax the accumulated wealth of the country while continuing to burden ordinary consumers through tariffs. But the majority had spoken. The income tax was dead, struck down by the very Constitution it was meant to serve. For the next 18 years, the battle over the income tax became a defining issue in American politics. Progressives in both parties, Democrats and insurgent Republicans alike, kept pushing. They argued that the Constitution should be amended to explicitly authorize an income tax without the apportionment requirement. Conservatives and business interests fought back furiously, arguing that an income tax would give the federal government dangerous new powers and open the door to confiscatory redistribution. In 1909, something unexpected happened. President William Howard Taft, who was no radical, proposed a constitutional amendment authorizing the income tax. Many conservative Republicans in Congress actually supported it, partly because they were convinced it would never be ratified. They believed that enough state legislatures would reject it to kill it for good. It was a cynical political calculation, and it backfired spectacularly. The amendment moved through the states with surprising speed. The progressive movement was at its height. Theodore Roosevelt was championing reform. The public was outraged by the excesses of the Gilded Age. State after state ratified the amendment, and on February 3, 1913, Delaware became the 36th state to give its approval. The 16th Amendment was now part of the Constitution. It read, in its entirety, "The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes, from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration." Just 1 month later, Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as president, and he wasted no time. Wilson pushed Congress to pass the Revenue Act of 1913, also known as the Underwood Tariff Act. The law did two things simultaneously. It slashed tariff rates by about 10%, and it imposed a new federal income tax to make up for the lost revenue. The initial tax was remarkably modest by today's standards. Incomes below $20,000 were taxed at just 1%. The highest rate, 7%, applied only to incomes above $500,000. The first Form 1040 appeared in 1914. It was 3 pages long. For the vast majority of Americans, the income tax was invisible. It touched only the very wealthiest. But Wilson's primary motivation wasn't actually redistribution. What he wanted, above all, was tariff reform. He saw the high protective tariffs that had dominated American trade policy for decades as a system of corporate welfare, enriching connected industrialists at the expense of ordinary consumers. The income tax was, in his mind, primarily a tool to replace tariff revenue and free the country from the grip of protectionism. Now, looking back at the old system from our vantage point today, it's tempting to romanticize it. A country with no income tax, where the government funded itself through trade duties and land sales, where citizens kept every dollar they earned. And it's true that the pre-1913 system had certain advantages. The government was small and relatively unobtrusive. The tax burden was hidden rather than felt directly, and the federal budget was usually balanced or even in surplus. But the old system also had deep structural problems that are easy to overlook. The tariff was regressive. It hit the poorest Americans hardest. It created a system of corporate protectionism that enriched the politically connected at the expense of consumers. It tied the government's revenue to the unpredictable fluctuations of international trade. And it was utterly inadequate for the challenges of the 20th century. The two world wars, the Great Depression, the Cold War, the construction of the interstate highway system, the space race, the expansion of Social Security and Medicare, none of these would have been remotely possible under a tariff-based revenue system. The income tax didn't just change how the government collected money, it changed the fundamental relationship between the citizen and the state. Before 1913, the federal government was something that most Americans rarely encountered in their daily lives. You might see a customs officer at a port or a postal worker delivering mail, but that was about it. After 1913, the government became an intimate presence in every working person's life. It knew how much you earned. It took a share before you even cashed your paycheck. And that share grew relentlessly as the decades passed. What happened next is one of the most dramatic fiscal escalations in the history of any democracy. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, the government needed enormous sums of money to mobilize an army of 4 million men and ship them across the Atlantic. The modest income tax that had been introduced just 4 years earlier was suddenly transformed into a revenue juggernaut. Congress expanded the tax base dramatically, lowering the exemption threshold so that millions more Americans had to pay, and it raised the rates to levels that would have been unthinkable in 1913. During the First World War, the top marginal rate was raised to 77%. During the Second World War, it climbed to 94%. Even after the wars ended, the rates never returned to anything resembling the original 1 to 7% range. The income tax, which had been sold to the public as a modest levy on the ultra-wealthy, gradually expanded to encompass virtually every working American. And here's the deepest irony in this entire story. The tariff system that the income tax was designed to replace didn't actually disappear. Tariffs continued to exist alongside the income tax. The United States still collects customs duties on imported goods. They just became a tiny fraction of total federal revenue instead of the dominant source. Before 1913, tariffs accounted for 50 to 90% of federal income. Today, they account for roughly 1 to 2%. The transition from a tariff-funded government to an income tax-funded government is one of the most consequential shifts in American history, and yet it's one that most people know almost nothing about. We treat the income tax as though it were written into the fabric of reality, as though it's always existed and always will, but it hasn't. For the majority of American history, the idea that the government would directly tax your wages was considered radical, unconstitutional, and un-American. It took a civil war, a Supreme Court showdown, a constitutional amendment, and a progressive political revolution to make it happen. The story of how America funded itself before 1913 isn't just a history lesson. It's a reminder that the systems we take for granted are not permanent or inevitable. They were built by specific people, for specific reasons, in response to specific crises, and they can be changed again. Whether you think the income tax is a necessary pillar of modern civilization or an unjust overreach of government power, one thing is beyond dispute. It fundamentally altered the contract between the American people and their government in ways that the founders could never have imagined. So the next time you look at your paycheck and see that chunk missing before it even reaches your bank account, remember this: that deduction represents one of the most dramatic power shifts in American history. And for 124 years, nobody in this country ever had to see it. Now, if you stuck till the very end, I'd appreciate it if you could leave a comment letting me know your thoughts. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel. It would mean a lot. I'll see you in the next one.